The next intercultural dimension that I would like to talk about is time. How we relate to time. Actually, time, again, we can break down into two distinct elements. And the first is our culture or our country as a whole. Is it very much oriented toward the past, to traditions, or are we very much grounded in the present, or are we planning or looking ahead in the future? You'll find more information about this on our website, www.self-help.training. The second and maybe more interesting variable when it comes to time is single focus or multi-focus. What does it mean? In a single focus culture, people tend to do one thing after another. You're working toward deadlines, and when you're not meeting a deadline, that causes a lot of stress. And on the other hand, we've got cultures that are more multi-focused, where you're doing many things at the same time. Deadlines are not as rigid, and we improvise and adjust as we go along. Let me give you some examples. South Africa, where I come from, is actually an interesting case study because we have different cultures within South Africa when it comes to time. Many moons ago, I used to work for the Electoral Commission, and just before the election, we had a meeting where we were discussing whether we were about to meet the deadlines that had been set for our region. And during this meeting, my colleague, who was Afrikaner, said, "This is really difficult because we are not going to be meeting our deadlines. We've not reached them, and we should seriously consider whether we are in fact going to postpone the election year in our area because we are right now not on target to meet all of the deadlines, and therefore we cannot really fulfill the criteria that have been set." And then on the other hand, one of my African colleagues said, "Why are you people getting so worried about meeting the deadline? This meeting the deadline is not so important, because if you are doing things properly, good planning means that you are never able to meet a deadline. Because if the people, they can meet the deadline, it means the planning was poor. It was too easy to meet the deadline. If you are planning things properly, it means that the people, they are working toward meeting the deadline, but they will not be able to meet it exactly." So, to give you maybe another example, when we would have a meeting, my colleague that was Afrikaner would say, if the meeting was scheduled for 10 o'clock and it would last for 1 hour, and we got everything done after 45 minutes, he would say, "All right, well, we've planned for 1 hour, but so are there any other issues that you guys want to bring up? Because I've still got 15 minutes. And on the other hand, my African colleague would say, "What is the point? Everything has been said." And if we were not able to discuss everything within 1 hour, as originally planned, but the meeting was productive, he would ask, "What is the problem? The meeting is going very well. We are making a lot of headway. There are some issues to talk about. So the next meetings, you are just going to push back." One time we sat down and he told me, "The European people and the American people, I don't understand these people. They are always planning everything down to the hour, down to the minute. Me too. I was trying to plan my day this way. And, I sat down and I tried to plan 10 o'clock, 11, 12, 1, 2. I tried to plan the whole day. But I discovered, I can make a plan, but the day has got a plan of its own. And I see it time and time again. The next dimension that I want to introduce is power. Now, we have power differences in every culture, but the extent to which our culture accepts or embraces these differences or prefers to minimize them differs from country to country and from region to region and also in organizations. So we call this power distance. When the power distance is high, people in the culture accept that there are power differences, that some people have a lot and other people don't. Let me give you some examples of cultures that have high power distance globally. China, for example, is considered to be high power distance. India, traditionally, also is a culture that was high power distance. For example, in India, you had everyone was considered to be part of 4 castes. You were either part of the Brahman caste or the priest caste. You were Kshatriya, or you're part of the warrior caste. You're part of the merchant or the trader caste, and so on. And then within each of these castes, again, you would have subcastes. You would marry someone from the same caste, but not necessarily the same subcaste. This is called the Gotra system. So traditionally, India had high power distance. It's changing, and it's moving away from there. Also, China. But on the other hand of the scale, we've got, for example, Scandinavia. Take Sweden. I remember when I was working in Sweden, it was very interesting. I went to a big factory of 2,000 employees. And in this factory, during lunchtime, the managers and the workers were not sitting in separate areas. They weren't even sitting at separate tables. The CEO of the company was sitting right next to his secretary, because Sweden is a culture that maintains low power distance and that tries to minimize or soften these power differences. Let me give you some examples of how that may play out. In a culture that maintains high power distance, such as, for example, in some rural areas in South Africa, if you went there and you were a manager in charge of someone, you went to one of the employees and you said, well, what do you think about this or that innovation? The person would look at you and they would say, what do you mean? What do you think? You are the manager. You are going to tell us. It is not for me to think. You are the manager. You're going to, what do you think? And on the other hand, if you go to a country such as Sweden or also to Denmark, where there's very low power distance, as a manager, you permanently have to reckon with the fact that employees might come up to you and they might have suggestions for further improvement. In Sweden, for example, which has very low power distance, it is quite customary for the employees to come up to their managers and to raise any topics, because by law in Sweden, the workers have to be consulted for any type of change at the workplace. So, on any type of issue, you want to introduce a new software, you have to consult your employees. And people are used to coming up to you to discuss things. These were rather, some examples of how this could play out in practice. The next Intercultural dimension that I'd like to bring up is masculinity and femininity. We've got some cultures that are more oriented toward masculinity, and we've got other cultures that are more orientated toward femininity. What does it mean? In a culture that is very masculine, there is a strict separation of gender roles. People are not very flexible when it comes to gender roles. Boys are different from girls. They're brought up to be very different, and such cultures are generally more competitive. An example of a masculine culture traditionally was Japan. Japan is changing, but traditionally in the past, the Japanese culture was a very masculine culture. On the other end of the scale, we've got cultures that are more orientated toward femininity. There's not such a strict separation of the genders. At school, boys don't only do handcraft, but they may also learn knitting. And later on in life, in business, it's considered desirable for men to work in jobs that were, in the past, predominantly occupied by women, such as, for example, taking care of children in kindergartens or in a creche. In cultures that are orientated more toward femininity, there isn't the same degree of competitiveness that there is in the more masculine cultures. So Sweden and Scandinavia are cultures that are more orientated towards femininity. Let me give you another example from my life. I worked in Germany for many years, and I was talking to one of my friends in South Africa, and I was telling him that in Germany, which is now also, in the past it was very masculine, but it has moved more toward femininity. It's not as feminine, or it's not as strongly orientated toward femininity as Sweden, but it's not that far removed. So I was telling him about Germany, and I was pointing out that in Germany they have introduced maternity leave, of course. So a woman, if she's pregnant, she gets time off. After birth, she gets more time off, where she has 1 year that is paid for by the government, where she can take care of her child, paid child leave. And they introduced a new law in Germany whereby men could also take off 2 months in addition to the woman if they wanted to. And my South African friend had difficulties grappling with this idea. And he asked me, hey, the German people, they're always on holidays? You're telling me they are getting another holiday while they are getting 2 months paid vacation to do things? And I said, no, because these 2 months are in addition to the 1 year that the woman gets by paid leave. What do you mean they are in addition? I said, well, the woman, she goes back to work. Oh, the woman, she's working? What do you mean? And then the man, he's left with the baby? I said, yeah. What? The man, he's left with the baby. How is he taking care of the baby? Number one, he is not biologically equipped to take care of the baby. He said, yeah, but technology. Put the milk in a bottle. What? But then you've also got the diapers. Me, I'm never going to be changing any diapers. It is out of the question. So in a more masculine culture, men typically wouldn't perform these roles. So where's your own culture posited on this dimension? The next dimension that I would like to talk about is individualism. Individualism versus collectivism. Some cultures are more individualistic. In an individualistic culture, it's all about the individual. The United States is a more individualistic culture. And there's a saying, me, myself, and I. It's all about the individual. On the other hand of the scale, we've got cultures that are more collectivistic. China, for example, is a more collectivistic culture. Although, interestingly enough, China is now changing and it's moving away from being more collectivistic to the individualistic direction. So that we have actually in China big generational differences. But let's talk a little bit about this. Let me give you some examples. In Chinese, for example, typically Chinese, when they communicate with each other, would be using their surname. So you identify with your surname and only then comes your first name. Who are you? I am Zhang or Wang or whatever my family name is, and only then would I give my first name. Why? Because I don't exist as an individual. I belong to this family. I'm working for this company in this capacity. I'm an engineer. I come from this city. I'm Chinese. And I define myself through all of these collective identities. In fact, 20 years ago, you could not translate the word individualist into Mandarin. There was no exact word to describe that. The closest word was outcast, outside of the group. I don't belong to a group. I am outside of the group. But as I said, the Chinese culture has changed, and now there is a term for individualist, which shows us also that cultures are permanently in transition. We might try to plot a culture, but like a moving picture, it's here at a certain point and then it's over there. So it's a little bit like a Polaroid shot or like a photo, but it's ever moving. The last dimension that I want to talk about is structure or tolerance for ambiguity. What does it mean? Some cultures are very structured. That is to say, they have a very low tolerance for ambiguity. Other cultures are less structured. They have a high tolerance for ambiguity. Let me give you some examples. First of all, this dimension overlaps a little bit to some degree with another dimension called universalism and particularism. Universalistic cultures have laws that are known to everybody, and everybody is expected to follow the laws at all times. Most Western European cultures are universalistic. Scandinavia, Great Britain, the United States, and Germany are more universalistic than, say, for example, Italy. On the other hand, we've got cultures that are particularistic. In a particularistic culture, there are rules, there are laws, there are procedures, but people are not necessarily expected to follow the laws strictly and in every situation. So, universalism and particularism to some degree overlaps with structure. So when we talk about structure, cultures that are highly structured, there's a need for rules, for systems, and procedures. People want to know exactly where they're at. And on the other hand, we've got cultures that are not very structured, where people tend to improvise more. They tend to do things as they go along. They don't follow the rules rigidly. They interpret things in their own way. Let me give you some examples. Many, many moons ago, the University of Trier conducted an experiment. And they said, let's create an absurd rule and let us see whether people will follow this absurd rule. So what they did is they went to 2 telephone booths. Remember, in the old days, people weren't carrying mobile phones, so they had to go to telephone booths if they wanted to call someone. So they went to 2 telephone booths, and they chose telephone booths that were near a dark area or a space where people could hide, trees, and so on. And via a device called a walkie-talkie, they would communicate with a man and a woman that was hiding near the telephone booth. So they took these 2 telephone booths and they put up signs. And on one telephone booth they wrote, "Only for men," and on the other one, "Only for women." When a man came, the man would come out of the bushes or out of this dark space and would go into the telephone booth for men. If a woman came, a woman would emerge and she would go into the telephone booth for women. Now the question was, the person that came to make a phone call, what would they do? You're a man and you see there are 2 telephone booths, but the telephone booth for men is occupied. Or you're a woman. You come to a telephone booth and you see the telephone booth for women is occupied. What would you do in this scenario? So now this experiment was conducted many, many moons ago. Today, of course, the results would be different because, as I've pointed out, culture is permanently changing. But at the time, what the University of Trier found was that most Germans, the vast majority of Germans, stood in line, waiting. If you were a man, you're waiting outside of the telephone booth for men. If you were a woman, you're waiting outside of the telephone booth for women. And they replicated this experiment in different European countries. And they found the lowest amount of compliance in Italy. Most Italians didn't follow the rule that was prescribed. And in Italian, there's a saying that a rule is only broken if a policeman sees it. In Bulgaria, there's a saying that a rule or a law is like a door on an open field. Do you want to go through it or not? What about your own culture? Do you expect people to follow the rules, or are you flexible in applying rules? So we've talked about these intercultural dimensions, and hopefully you now have a better idea of how to conceptualize these differences. Keep in mind that culture is ever-changing, and also there are these many different levels of culture, so there may be a wider variety within your own culture. In fact, in order to make an intracultural experience, you don't necessarily have to meet somebody from abroad. You may be able to do all of this within your own culture. For example, you could decide one day you'll go to the Association of Ecological Farmers. The next day, you'll go to the Hells Angels. Then you'll go to the Swingers Club. On another day, you may go to the Jehovah's Witnesses or to a very religious group, and so on and so on. And you'll see that there is a lot of cultural variation within your own country. Ultimately, it's not just about conceptualizing differences, knowing what are my own cultural preferences and what are the preferences of the people that I'm communicating and interacting with. It's about adapting, or rather style shifting. Let me give you an example of the art of style shifting. I once had a Japanese participant in one of my workshops, and he said, I have found a great example of style shifting. I went on a cruise in the Mediterranean, and the cruise took off in Genoa, Italy. Most of the participants of the cruise were either German, American, or Japanese. And they all like cruises for different reasons. So he said it was quite interesting. Here we were in the departure hall of the ship. And to begin with, the captain, who was Greek, spoke with the Americans. And he told everybody, welcome to our cruise, which is going to take us to, went through all the destinations. If you have any questions, you'll find our information counter on the ground floor of the ship. Our English-speaking personnel is available to answer any of your questions at any time from Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. Please stop by. Before we board the ship, I'd just like to do one thing. Here's a clap for the men that let the women and children embark first. You guys are my heroes. Next, through an interpreter, the captain spoke with the Germans. And the interpreter, in this case, adjusted their communication to make it culturally more palatable. And what the interpreter said, in essence, was, I would like to welcome you on behalf of the captain on our cruise, which will take us to, went through all the destinations. Our German-speaking personnel is available on the ground floor of the ship from 9 to 12 and 1 to 5, Monday through Friday. We are also available on Saturdays from 9 to 12. We have detailed brochures with all of the destinations that we will be visiting. Before we disembark, we just want to point out that there is a rule that says the women and the children will come first. And finally, the interpreter communicated with the Japanese and told them something along the lines of, on behalf of the captain, I'd like to welcome you on our cruise, which will take us to, went through all the destinations. On the ground floor of the ship, we have an information counter where you will find brochures with photos of all of the destinations that we'll be visiting. Please stop by and say hello. Our friendly Japanese speaking personnel is available to answer your questions. Before we disembark, I'd just like to ask you for one thing. Please look carefully at the other people. So, in this example, we see how intercultural communication plays out in practice. Let's begin with the Americans. American culture, highly individualistic. So you appeal to the individual. Here's a clap for those guys, for those men that let the women and children embark first. Then, through the interpreter, the communication with the Germans. The German culture has a very low tolerance for ambiguity. Things are black and white and people are expected to follow rules. So, you tell them, there's a rule that says the women and the children embark first. Bada bing, bada boom. Finally, we come to the Japanese. The Japanese culture is more collectivistic. Just look at the other people. And people follow and do as they're expected. So, I hope that you can use these dimensions, you start thinking about how you might apply them, and for more information on these intercultural dimensions, please visit our website at www.self-help.training.